Another angle here is the kind of a networking angle. So anybody who does this, and I know you know this very well, Eric, if you're in B2B marketing, so much of what you're trying to do to enable your sales team is just to get them qualified leads, right? To get your salespeople to have one-on-one conversations with buyers, essentially, right? That's what all the content that you put out there, it's all aimed at convincing people finally that they trust you, they know you a little bit. Okay, I'm ready to actually have a conversation with a person at your company. I see a podcast as a way to, like, a real shortcut for all that, because people like being on podcasts, and you can use it as a networking tool. You can use it as an account-based marketing tool, right? Identify accounts you want to get into, identify within those accounts. I want to talk to the VP of marketing or the VP of operations or whatever. And if you have a podcast that's about those things, that's about the kinds of things that a, operations manager or whatever would talk about, invite those folks onto your show. You get a lot of yeses that way, a lot more yeses than you'll get from a cold email saying, can we have 15 minutes of your time to demo our whatever, our software. Get a lot of no's that way. Get a lot of yeses from the podcast invite because it's cool. People like being on podcasts. There's obvious value. They're going to get to be featured in content and be featured as a subject matter expert and get it out there on the internet. And it's good for their personal brand. It's good for their company. So that's another part of the value. It's a really good way to get to talk to whoever you want to talk to.
It is time for Build That Podcast, where we will discuss how you can use a podcast to grow your business and expand your influence. I'm your host, Eric Rutherford. Let me encourage you to sign up for the 200 words to move you forward with marketing and podcasting, delivered right to your inbox each Tuesday. Sign up for it at buildthatpodcast.com/the 200. I'll also put it in the show notes. Now, let's jump into today's episode. And I am excited today because I have with me Jeremy Shere. He is founder and CEO of Connversa, which is a B2B branded podcast agency. He has created multiple podcasts as a podcast host. His current podcast is the B2B Content Show, so we'll make sure that link goes in the show notes. He's also a former college professor at Indiana University, where he earned his PhD and taught journalism. So, Jeremy, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you so much, Eric. It is really cool to be here.
It is. It's really fun to connect because we, right before the show started, we were just chatting about just developing this relationship, this friendship over LinkedIn, and now we're having a real conversation, so to speak, voice to voice. So I'm excited.
Yeah, me too. It's really, we were saying it's so cool to go from LinkedIn where you're just doing it by text and you see the person's picture and then you meet them and you're like, oh, hey, you're a real person. Okay, this cool.
I know it is. It's one of those really, it's one of the cool facets of LinkedIn and connecting that way. So
for sure.
One of the, before we get into Connversa, before we get into B2B podcasting, one of the things I found fascinating was your journalism background. Mm-hmm. I have a talk with another guy, former coworker. He had journalism. He's a freelance journalist. And so I thought that was fascinating. So I got to ask, was the dream job to work for the New York Times, Washington Post, or were you looking at radio or television? How did journalism come about?
Yeah. So that was not the dream job, actually. So growing up, and from the time I was a little kid, I always wanted to be a writer. It's just something that came naturally to me. We have some writers in the family, and I'm old enough so that I grew up before the internet and before even cable TV. So it wasn't as much to do. So a lot of reading of books, a lot of writing stories, So I wanted to be a writer. And I actually was more keen on becoming a professor. You mentioned I did eventually teach at the journalism school at Indiana University, but I went to IU as a grad student and I got a PhD in English literature. And so I was headed down an academic path. And because as an undergrad, I studied English at the University of Michigan, and I I was a good student. My professors always encouraged me, like, you should go become a professor. And I thought to myself, well, that sounds pretty great. A life of reading and writing and teaching and discussing books. And so I went down that path. And along the way, I was doing some freelance writing. And so that's kind of where the journalism stuff comes in. Long story short, I went to graduate school, learned about halfway through, it took that long to learn that I actually didn't want to do that I actually didn't want to be a professor, primarily because it's really not about reading great books and enjoying them and talking about them. It's more about literary theory, and which I just was not that into. And also, more particularly, the kind of writing you end up doing is highly technical for a very select audience of maybe literally like 5 other people in the world who maybe will read what you write. And that just didn't appeal to me at a certain point. I could kind of do it, but I had to force myself. I didn't love it. And along the way, just to make some extra money, because as a graduate student, you're essentially taking a vow of poverty, like during your prime earning years. Just to make a little extra money, I just started like doing some freelance stuff on the side. There was like a public radio show about science that I started writing for. I have no science background, but I'm a good writer. So I started doing that. And I just started doing essentially freelance journalism. Some of it actual journalism, like for magazines, some of it more marketing type stuff, like for the university. But I just found that I was better at that kind of writing than I was at academic writing. I like that I got paid for it. I'm like, oh, you can actually make some money doing this. That's interesting. Okay, that might be a good thing to have in my life. And so that's really where the journalism stuff came in. Still I was like, I'm just better at this kind of writing, this kind of storytelling than I am at the academic stuff. And it's also how I got into podcasting, because I started writing for some radio shows. And then that led to opportunities to be on the radio and learn how to produce audio. I'm also kind of a musician, a songwriter. So I was used to recording music, recording audio, and it's the same equipment, same basic process for recording a podcast. So that's kind of how I came to where I am and how the journalism stuff fits into it.
Okay, that makes sense. So it was one of those things, you, like many things, you just, it's that next logical step, and it just like was that next thing on the path. And sometimes it is, how can I just pay the rent? Right.
Right. Yeah.
But it seems like too, just the writing, anybody listening who's thinking about starting a podcast. And if you have, been involved with podcasting, how much writing is involved at a very core level, and that whole journalism aspect. So I imagine that really served you well as you moved into this space.
Yeah, I think it does in a few kind of specific ways. Of course, podcasting is mostly an audio medium, right? So it's not writing first and foremost, but the writing does come in for show notes, right? For writing titles for episodes. And in a kind of broader way, I think just thinking in a kind of storytelling mindset. That's really what it is. And that's where, and I've done some podcast episodes on this, talking with guests who also have a journalism background, that one thing that you do learn as a journalist is storytelling techniques. And there are very specific ones. For a newspaper, there's the inverted pyramid style. That's one kind of storytelling. For magazine writing, which is what I taught primarily, it's a little bit different. And there are different techniques for how you start a story and draw readers in and keep them going and use quotes and build out some tension in the story, all that stuff. I think that is definitely applicable to really any kind of content that you're doing. But podcasting, especially because I think podcasting is a powerful storytelling medium, and that it's especially good for storytelling because it's long form. And when you're having conversations, I think good podcast content often has a lot of storytelling baked into it. So that's where I see a lot of the value of the journalism. It's not so much that I'm spending a lot of time writing outside of the show notes and stuff. It's more the mindset, if that makes sense.
It does. And I think that's been something I've been I've been writing some about lately, and just this idea of how do you ask a good question? How do you write a good question? How do you think of a podcast in a narrative form? What's that look like? People may not even think about that as being part of a podcast process. And yet the good podcasts have it in there, right? It's sort of baked in so that it's so subtle you don't realize it.
Yeah, no, for sure. And they're all different kind of podcasts, all different kind of styles, right? And there are different ways to do storytelling in a podcast. One way is to explicitly do a storytelling podcast, like a scripted narrative podcast. And I have a decent amount of experience doing that when you're writing a script and doing the voiceover narration and then using sound bites and so on. I mean, that's kind of the classical storytelling, which I like doing those kind of episodes. And kind of one of my dreams is to find a B2B client that wants to do that, because it's more expensive and takes more time. But it would be great because you'd stand out. I think probably the vast majority of B2B shows are interview style. And there are a handful that are more elaborate and more like in the storytelling, This American Lifestyle, but very few. But it would be so cool to be able to do that. If you're a brand in your niche and you have that kind of show, you're going to stand out because no one else is doing it.
I agree. I think that's fascinating. I would love to see that. And you would stand out. And honestly, it would take a while for other people to catch up to you, because that's not something you can just, turn on a dime. You would have a good runway to really make your mark with it.
Exactly. Because to produce that kind of episode, you need different kind of skill set. It's no longer enough just to have like a producer who can hit record and then do some editing or whatever, or help you shape the episodes. Now you need a script writer, and not just any writer, but a script writer who knows how to write for someone to perform. That's very different than, if you're just like a copywriter. It's a whole different thing. You need a voiceover talent. Again, that's a very particular skill, and you just need someone then a producer who knows how to put that all together. It's different than producing an interview style podcast. I think it can be learned, but I think you're right. If there's a B2B brand out there that sort of has the I don't know, like the fortitude to take a bit of a chance and spend a little bit more time and money on that, yeah, it would be. You'd build a little bit of a moat around it, because it would be pretty hard. It's hard. It's much harder to do. It takes more time. So your rivals couldn't just immediately turn around and start doing it. You'd have a significant head start.
Yeah,
sure.
That would be fascinating. So when you find that client, let me know so I can tune in to that podcast when you launch it, because I would love to hear it played out, because I think that would be brilliant.
Yeah, fingers crossed. We'll see if it happens.
So speaking of B2B, let's just kind of jump into Connversa. So when you say a B2B branded podcasting agency, so what is Connversa, and what problem do you solve for businesses?
So I want to make sure that I answer all parts of that question. So was the first part like, what do we mean by a B2B branded podcast?
Yeah, let's go with that. Let's because I realized I blended like three questions all in one. So let's start with, what is a B2B branded podcast, and then what is Connversa, and how do you help that?
Okay, got it. So, let me start with what is Connversa. So Connversa is the name of my company. I came up with that name because it's the mashing together of two things that I think we really do. And it's connection. So that's CONN, connection through conversation. So Connversa. And it does have two N's, which I realize is not super optimal, because you wouldn't naturally think so. But anyway, that's what Connversa means. And that's where the name of the company comes from. And when I say that we are a B2B branded podcasting agency, what that means simply is that we work with B2B brands to help them start a branded podcast. And a branded podcast simply means that it's a podcast that is brought to you by this company, essentially. But that actually is significant in that, because for B2B branded podcasting to work, the podcast can never be about yourself, about the company, because that's boring. and it's essentially a commercial for yourself, right? And just no one's going to listen to that. No one cares. No one wants to hear you talk about yourself episode after episode. And so the way that it does work is you start a podcast that is aimed at the people you want to talk to, right? Your audience, which also includes all of your prospects and customers and so on. So the podcast is for them, and meaning that the content has to be the things that they care most about. And that does not include you and your company and what you do, right? Even if they're a customer, like they get value from you, but it's not like they want to know all about you all the time, right? They just want to learn about the things in their industry that are going to help them day to day, help them be better at their job, help them get a better review at the end of the year, that kind of thing. So that's what a B2B branded podcast is. And that's what I mean when I say that we're a B2B branded podcasting agency, because that's what we focus on primarily. And in other words, there are plenty of podcast agencies out there that are just open to anybody, business, any individual person, a creator, whatever. We are specifically focused on B2B brands. And that's just part of our strategy, because I think there's, B2B is a whole world unto itself. And there's so much to learn about how marketing works and how a podcast can work as a marketing tool and so on. So that's what that is all about.
No, and that makes sense. And I appreciate that distinction, because I think we hear podcast and we get one idea of what that can be, but you have a narrow niche within that branded B2B, and that sounds like it has some very specific characteristics. Those are specific companies with set parameters. So I appreciate you kind of talking through that. So if you're listening, and you're in a business, that could be something that your business can do. So, this could be an opportunity or a way to think through marketing, through reaching out and through expanding your brand. So, which it sounds like is what those companies are doing. You're helping them do.
Yeah. So, and that was the other part of your question, right, Eric? So what problem are we helping them solve? Right. And I think it's a couple of different but related problems. So one is, for your typical B2B content marketing team, they're under a lot of pressure to produce all kinds of content, and time is short. One problem we help them solve through podcasting is creating a podcast that functions as a content engine, and that can create high quality content. I like to say better content than maybe you've been creating. And what I mean by that is, because the content you're creating it's a dialogue, right? It's not just our team wrote these 5 blog posts and we, did some research on the internet. It's like, no, this is all content in conversation with subject matter experts, right? And it's aimed at this sort of an external audience. And so you're drawing from that very audience to bring people on the show. So it's just, I think that's higher level content, because it's a conversation and you're exploring an idea in real time. And I think there's just a ton of value there. So that's one problem, is just the time. It's so much more efficient to have a podcast and then repurpose it into all kinds of other content. And I'm not saying or arguing at all that you don't need anything but a podcast. Of course, you need all kinds of channels and content, but you take a single 20-minute, 25-minute podcast interview, you record video at the same time. So now you have an audio product, you have 25 minutes of video, which you can chop up into however many shorter videos, right? Easily 10, 15, no problem. And for social media, transcribe the podcast, clean up the transcript, and now you've got some text to work with. You can write however many blog posts, or use that for copy for a newsletter or for your webpage, right? So if you set it up properly, then the podcast can really function as kind of the hub of a machine from which you get just like a waterfall of fresh, really good, high quality content. So that's one problem that we're helping to solve, just the time that it would otherwise take to create all that content. Another angle here is the kind of a networking angle. So anybody who does this, and I know you know this very well, Eric, if you're in B2B marketing, so much of what you're trying to do to enable your sales team, right, is just to get them qualified leads, right? To get to get your salespeople to have one-on-one conversations with buyers, essentially, right? That's what all the content that you put out there, it's all aimed at convincing people finally that they trust you, they know you a little bit. Okay, I'm ready to actually have a conversation with a person at your company. I see a podcast as a way to, like, a real shortcut for all that, because people like being on podcasts, and you can use it as a networking tool. You can use it as an account-based marketing tool, right? Identify accounts you want to get into, identify within those accounts, I want to talk to the VP of marketing or the VP of operations or whatever. And if you have a podcast that's about those things, that's about the kinds of things that a operations manager or whatever would talk about, invite those folks onto your show. You get a lot of yeses that way, a lot more yeses than you'll get from a cold email saying, can we have 15 minutes of your time to demo our whatever, our software. Get a lot of no's that way. Get a lot of yeses from the podcast invite because it's cool. People like being on podcasts. There's obvious value. They're going to get to be featured in content and be featured as a subject matter expert and get it out there on the internet. And it's good for their personal brand. It's good for their company, right? So that's another part of the value. Just, it's a really good way to get to talk to whoever you want to talk to. And to put a finer point on it, let's say you partner with sales and you say, give us the names and emails of 10 prospects who are somewhere in the funnel, but they're kind of in that messy middle. They're kind of stuck. Let's get them on the show. Let's break the ice. Let's build more trust. Let's deepen the relationship. Let's get them on the show. Let's create content with them. Let's promote them. That's going to go a long way towards helping them trust you a little bit more. Just staying in front of them. So that's another, use case for podcasting. And then there's, brand awareness. Most of our clients that we're working with, they already have an audience. So we're not trying to build an audience from scratch for their podcast, but they're always trying to serve that audience in different ways, right? And grow it and reach more people. So again, anyone in podcasting knows this as kind of podcasting 101, but it is the only kind of content that you can consume while doing other things, walking the dog, in your car, whatever else you're doing. And it's long form. So for people to listen to a 30-minute podcast while, exercising or whatever is very typical. And you can go deep and you can go long form on content that otherwise might be hard to get people to engage with, like a 30-page ebook or something. Not so many people are going to read the whole thing, or a 30-minute video. Better be really good if people are going to watch the whole damn thing, or a super long 5,000 word blog post, same deal. It's just with the podcast, it's so much more convenient. And so I think you can go deeper into subjects in a way that's just harder in other types of media. So another problem that we help solve, if you want to call it that, is a better way to do long form content.
There is so much that could be unpacked from your answer. And I agree with all of it. I think just from the repurposing to the ease of consumption to all of it. And I think some people get that or understand that. Some people understand parts of it. One thing that I'd love for you to elaborate on, because I think when businesses, especially, they're thinking podcasts, they're thinking, okay, I'm going to communicate, I'll build relationships, but I'm really like, how will this help me sell something? And so I liked how you were describing, why don't you bring some customers on and just have a conversation? Would you elaborate on what that could look like for a company? Because I'm sure some people are going, that sounds awesome. Can you put a framework around that?
Yeah, sure. And that's a great question, Eric, because there might be some skepticism around like, okay, well, fine. Yeah, sure. You can get people to come on a podcast, but you said just before, you're not supposed to talk about yourself or your services or your offering. So how does that help? Like how is this going to lead to sales essentially? Right. So I think there are a couple ways of thinking about that. One is it's the same for all content marketing, right? Like we were talking about a little bit before. You're not, if all you're doing is putting out content about your products and services, then, you're doing product marketing, but the kind of stuff you're seeing on LinkedIn, right? And just like content marketing generally, it's thought leadership, right? So in a way, this is the same thing. except I would argue that it could be even more powerful since you are in dialogue, literally. You can have a half-hour conversation with a buyer, the very buyer who you really want to buy your stuff. You know they're not going to buy from you until they get to know your company and trust you and like you and all that good stuff. What better way to engender trust than to have a one-on-one conversation, right? Where you're putting the spotlight on that person and sort of doing them the honor, I guess you could say, of shining the spotlight on them. And then you're going to feature them. And so I think that's part of it. More explicitly, I think that there are spaces, there are opportunities to bring up your offering in the midst of dealing with, of getting to know guests on a podcast. So, for example, the way that we typically do it with clients, and that I do it myself with the B2B content show. So, I'll do a prep call with guests. I think that's very valuable. Even if you're not using the podcast as kind of a sales or a prospecting tool, still, it's just a good way to prepare and get to know the guest. But especially if you are using it that way, low stakes, it's an opportunity to ask the guest all kinds of questions about themselves, their company, the challenges they deal with day to day, all of the exact things that you need to know in order to make a sale. Really digging into the customer's pain points. And the more opportunity you have to learn those things directly from the mouth of your potential customer, the better it is, right? The more intelligence you have to then be able to talk to them in a way, or communicate with them in a way that's going to resonate. To the prep call, let's say you're just asking all kinds of questions about their pain points, and they mention something, and your solution is like the perfect fit to solve that very problem. Again, there are always all kinds of opportunities if you're doing this right. Say, like, you've done the call, and then you can say, toward the end of this prep call, let's say, you say, okay, great. I think we're all ready to go. By the way, you mentioned that one of your biggest challenges is this. You may or may not know that we actually have, we offer a service or whatever, a product that actually addresses that very thing. If you're ever interested in exploring it, we could set something up. They might say, and then, depending on the guest will respond how they respond, but you can learn a lot from that response, right? Ideally, they'll be like, oh, okay, awesome. Yes, I want to learn about that. Okay, good. Then you're on the right path. They might say, okay, good to know. Or they might say, well, no, I'm not interested in that. But that's good to know, right? I mean, now you know. And you can kind of take it from there. It's just a way of gathering more intelligence about the people that you ideally need to know everything that you can know about them, right? And then the same thing with a podcast interview. It's another opportunity for, during the interview, mentally note what the guest is talking about. And then maybe there's an opportunity after you're done with the interview and you're just kind of, hey, that was really great. Thank you so much. Here's what we're going to do next steps. And same thing, I know, when you said that, it made me think of this, and that we actually do that for a lot of our customers. That might be something you'd be interested in. It's putting it out there in not forcing anything, not really going beyond that in terms of trying to sell, if that makes sense. Just kind of putting it out there, making it known. And then in the follow-up, so you're going to be following up with that guest anyway, right? To let them know when their episode's going to go live, and then when it does go live, and sharing the links and all that. And so at a certain point, you've made it known what you do. And people are not stupid, I think. If when they invite you to come on their podcast, the first thing they're going to do is check out the podcast, make sure it's real, make sure it makes sense for them to go on. And then it's, let's say the podcast lives on your company's website. Well, they'll notice that, of course, and they'll see like, oh, okay, well, this podcast is being produced by such and such company, and this is what they do. And like, okay, people are not dumb. Like, they know that this is part of your marketing effort. So it's not like they're going to be shocked and appalled that you're bringing up your service. It's just, if you do it in the right spirit, in the right way, without forcing anything, without making yourself the center of the conversation, because that's going to turn everybody off, that's basically how it works. It just, again, I'm being kind of long-winded about this, but I guess what it all boils down to is through the podcast, creating many more opportunities for your brand to get quality time with this prospect, to learn as much about them as you possibly can, and to create content with them. And when you can, as appropriate, kind of putting stuff out there to kind of get the sense of how interested might this person be. And that's kind of as much as you can do, and then just like B2B sales, like you just have to stay relevant, stay in front of them. And if they're going to buy from you, it's going to be on their schedule, not yours. So, but the podcast is just a way to get quality conversations with the very buyers that otherwise might be super hard to get time with.
I think that's amazing. And because I know as a marketer, getting customer feedback is the goal, right? Because you don't know, you want to make sure you're solving their problem. You don't want to assume your product helps them. You want to find out what works, what doesn't. And so getting that literal conversation with a potential customer is incredibly valuable. And you're doing it in a way that it's not salesy. Like you say, if you can solve a problem, you can just, I like that. Just, hey, we have something that, we've helped customers with that before, if you're interested. And then it's just a passing comment. It's like, okay. And then they can think on it. So it's not like a hard sell. It's not like you've got, it's not like a 30-minute infomercial where you're trying to, beat them into submission.
Yeah.
which is important. It's really that conversation.
Yeah. And it's not, there's no quid pro quo about it either, right? Like it's not like, well, if you aren't interested, then we're not going to do the interview. Right. You do it in a little bit of an offhand way, or just, you're not trying to hide anything. You can be direct about it, but you're not saying like, so what do you think? Are you interested? Do you want to sign up? Like, you just put it out there, and then based on the response you get, you take it from there. Right. But if you do that consistently over time and you're talking to the right people, it does work. I think it's a win no matter what, because obviously not everyone you interview on your show is going to turn into a customer. Right. But even the ones that don't, you're creating content with them. You've developed a relationship with them. So if they don't turn into a customer now, they might down the road, or they might refer people to you. Right. They might become good referral partners. And even if that doesn't happen, you have good content. I mean, you're a content marketing team, right? Or, we all know to do marketing, you got to be doing content marketing. You got to do that some way. And again, like I said before, this is good content. You're interviewing a subject matter expert and having an unscripted conversation and going really deep on a specific topic that is a top priority for your audience to learn. I mean, that's a win, right? You have now created that content. And then you can repurpose it and create all this other content. So that's a win right there. Even if that particular guest doesn't become a client, still a win.
No, I agree. And I think that's one of the things that I've kind of latched onto these last few months is just the layers that a podcast can offer a business, both on customer research, that networking effect, the content options. And like you say, if you're interviewing what might be potential customers, you're going to learn a ton. And even if they don't buy, you still know what others are what matters to other people. So it's a total, you like you say, everybody wins in this. And it feels a little bit counterintuitive too, right? Because if you're a business, you're like, why should I help them? Right? Why should I market them? But really, it's almost like any other co-branded or partner marketing kind of thing where it's like, well, if you ever have both your logos on something, it's sort of the same thing.
But I'm glad you brought that up, though, because there is some subtlety to this. And I think it depends on what your goals are for a B2B podcast, right? So if your goal is thought leadership, then it might make more sense to focus on having your own subject matter experts as the primary guests, because you want to establish your brand as we have all this knowledge and expertise, right? And that you might not get as much value if you're mostly featuring people who are not part of your brand, right? Then really you're marketing them and their expertise, not so much your expertise. Still a little bit, because if you're a good host, you're asking good questions and demonstrating your, intelligence and knowledge through the questions you ask. But still, again, if thought leadership is your goal, then maybe focus on your own people. If prospecting is your goal, then you focus on outside people, right? And bringing them on the show. So part of it depends on, again, what your goals are. But even more broadly, I think, right, like what you said, Eric, just kind of like, well, why should we help those other people? Because helping people is good marketing, I think. Offering value, helping others, putting others' needs before your own, or like making that part of your brand. Like, we're a resource. We're not just in this to make a buck. We actually care about this industry and want to see it thrive and want to see everybody thrive. And, I think that's just good branding. That's good marketing.
When people see that in the marketplace, they're like, wow, they're like promoting other brands. It's very much a giving business. They're in this for, more than themselves. I think that speaks loads. People are attracted to that.
I think so. I think if you do it strategically, and that's part of your business model, then you can get a lot of value from it.
No, that makes sense. Where do you think B2B podcasts fail most often? So I know you've worked with a lot of businesses, you've listened to even more podcasts from businesses. What's that one thing or most often thing where they fail?
I think it's mostly time. And what I mean by that is that there are a lot of brands who might start a podcast, and there's a lot of excitement around it because it's relatively easy to start a podcast, even if you've never done it before. Just get a mic, find a host, record some stuff. Oh, cool. We have a podcast, design some cover art. And it's new and exciting at first, but then you start publishing it and you're not rocketing to the top of the Apple charts. You're not getting 1,000 downloads every, episode. And it's becoming work. Oh man, we're supposed to publish another episode next week and we don't have a guest for it. Who's going to find a guest? Whose job is that? It just ends up being way more work than you assumed it was going to be, because you're comparing it to the other stuff you do. Like, well, we have a blog, that's work, right? Podcast is a different thing. There's just more moving parts. And so I think what happens a lot is, and there are a vast number of podcasts that have like 3 episodes or fewer, and that's it. And they never go beyond that. That's not just B2B podcasts. That's podcast broadly. So I think what happens to people who start a podcast, whether it's an individual or a brand, they underestimate how much work it's going to be. And in particular, keeping the guest pipeline full, that in my experience is the single most time consuming and just annoying and kind of shitty part of the whole thing. It's like scheduling anything. A lot of emailing and canceling and rescheduling. It's just a chore. And if you don't have someone who's really on top of that, then it's so easy just to kind of get off track. And you're like, oh, we were supposed to publish one this week, but we didn't. And we'll publish it next week. And before you know it, you're just kind of off track and the numbers aren't there. And it just kind of fades out. It just kind of fades away. And that's where I see a lot of it fail. People underestimate the time. They don't have the right team in place. There are other things I see too that I don't know if it necessarily is the thing that makes a podcast fail, but a lot of times audio is not great because people maybe are recording on Zoom and it's just not. We're recording right now on Riverside FM, right? And that's a much better platform to record on. People are not using mics the right way. It doesn't sound good. Or maybe they have a host who's like okay, but not great. And it just sounds like every other podcast, The main thing is really just time. It gets to be too time consuming and people just let it, fade away. But then on top of that, there's all this other stuff and the quality isn't very good. And you just kind of, who has time to keep doing this thing that doesn't seem to be working anyway? I think that's what happens a lot of the time.
Now, and that makes sense. And it is time consuming much more than I think a lot of people realize to do it well. and to do it consistently. There's just a lot involved in that. And really, like you say, the payoff is not necessarily immediate. It's a long-term, long lead time kind of content piece. You can break out and do all kinds of things with, like you described earlier. But yeah, it takes a long time to get traction. One thing you mentioned within that was getting guests for your podcast. And that's something I'm kind of fascinated by. Do you think is it more art than science, or is it just sheer numbers, almost like dialing for dollars? If I just make, it's the measurement of, if I reach out to 1,000 people, I'll get 6.
Yeah.
What's been your experience with that? Because it is labor intensive and a challenge. So I'd love to get your take on that.
Well, I do have a system for doing this. And let me preface it by saying that for the B2B content show, we've published over 300 episodes, and we publish 3 times a week. So there's high demand for guests to be on the show, right? Like, we need to really keep that guest pipeline full. But we also have, as of this moment, for like a recording I do today, it's not going to go live until like June, because we have so many episodes in the can already. Frankly, too many. This is kind of an unexpected problem. I guess I'd rather have too many than too few, but still. And I produce that podcast. It's just me and an intern, really. And we have a system for being able to produce that many episodes and keep the pipeline full. So here's how we do it, essentially. And in answer to your specific question, Eric, there's definitely an art and a science to it. And I think the artfulness comes in the how you're reaching out, the whatever templates you're using to invite people to the podcast. It's nothing complicated. And I think it's like a lot of email, like best practice email reach out stuff. You're keeping things very short and simple, very clear, one call, clear to action, that kind of thing. And having, and there's a kind of, I guess, like an art into really understanding what kind of guest you're looking for, so you're reaching out to the right people. Once you know that, though, I mean, the way that we do it is, it kind of is a numbers thing. So we use LinkedIn, and we use LinkedIn Sales Navigator, where you can do like really targeted searches for, I'm looking for like a VP of marketing at a B2B brand of this, with this kind of headcount and with this kind of revenue, and you can do those super specific searches, and then it spits out a whole bunch of people, like thousands and thousands and thousands of people, and we'll go through. It actually does take quite a bit of time it's not just emailing all those people, because not all of them are good candidates, right? I'm looking specifically for, first of all, we have to go to look at the company and like, is this a B2B brand? Okay. Yes. Cool. Do they already have a podcast? If so, not a good candidate for us, and I'm not going to invite that person on. If they don't have a podcast, good candidate. Or if they have a podcast, but it's not good, or it's been dormant for a while, also good. So we'll pick just those people. Then you can export their information. We use another app to get email addresses, because you don't just get them from LinkedIn. And then we feed them into a email campaign, where we have like a drip campaign, essentially, where, over the course of 7 or 8 days or whatever, we'll send a series of emails to the people that we've scraped from LinkedIn, inviting them onto the show. And I don't have the numbers in front of me right here, but I mean, the open rates that you get and the responses are way better than what you get for a typical cold email campaign for like, we want to demo our software or anything. Definitely not everybody responds and says, yes, they want to be a guest. But if you keep this campaign going long enough and keep feeding it, then you'll get a whole bunch of people who say yes over time, because like I said earlier in our conversation, a lot of people like being on podcasts. They see it as something cool to do, and that's going to add value. So that's, in a nutshell, how we work it, how we find guests.
It's neat hearing how you do that, because I have something. You have I have a process. It's similar, but in terms of forms and formats, and how do you make the connections, and how do you find? I was just curious how much art, how much science. at some point in time, it is a numbers game, but you have to figure out what's working and then you can put it into a format.
I think the good news out there for any listeners who are like podcasters and want to, have a better guest pipeline solution. Again, I think it's a pretty easy sell to get someone to come on your podcast, even if it's brand new, even if the person's a big deal. It's easy to get yeses. So it's not like you have to go through 10 drafts of the email or something. It's basically just like, hey, I have this podcast. I think you'd be a great guest. Are you interested? And you put a link to it. And they're going to check it out, and either they want to do it or they don't. I'll also say, I also will spend time on LinkedIn in a more individual kind of bespoke way. If, as I'm scrolling through, if I find someone who is a B2B marketer and they have an interesting post and I check them out and they fit the persona that I'm looking for, I'll reach out to them just one-on-one and say, hey, I liked your post. Would you like to come on my show and talk about it? But it's as simple as that. That's it. You don't need to say much more than that. They know what a podcast is, and just keep it super simple. It's a yes or no question. Are you interested?
Yeah, I like that. And it really is. It's you, because you are serving them. You're saying, hey, I'm going to bring you on. I would love to have you. Let's just have a conversation. And you make them basically the center of the story. And that's a much easier sell than, okay, now I want you to pay X dollars for this service. And, it's a totally different opportunity.
We've all gotten emails from vendors, right? And their pitch is, hey, I'd love to jump on a call to learn about your business and your needs so that and I'm always like, well, why would I want to do that? What's in it for me? We all think that way. And if it's not obvious what's in it for me right off the jump, then I'm going to ignore it or say no. Because even if it's something that maybe I might have some use for or something, I don't know, just in that moment of time, if it's not like a burning need, then no, I'm not going to give you my time just for someone I don't know, some random person who wants to sell me their thing. You need to make it worth my while immediately, right? And I think offering to have someone on a podcast does that.
Yeah, it does. Especially like you say, you give them the opportunity to shine, to be the center. You have that conversation, especially if it's a B2B brand. Not only it's them, it's their brand. They, especially even in larger companies, suddenly they stand out even amongst their peers at the company, to where it's like, oh. So, I'm not only, the VP of marketing or the VP of sales or the VP, I'm also known elsewhere as this within this company.
Yeah. And I think that dovetails really nicely with like a burgeoning strategy in B2B marketing. And you see this on LinkedIn a lot. There's one guy in particular, Steve Watt is his name. And this is kind of his thing that he posts about. It's all about like how to be good on LinkedIn for companies. And his whole thing is like, well, look, it used to be you would have a company page on LinkedIn and let people know about, our latest offering, or we won an award, blah, blah, blah. And nobody cares about that stuff. And Steve's whole thing is like, no, individual employees should be on LinkedIn, not just resharing the company's stuff from the company page, but as themselves being part of the conversation on LinkedIn, talking about stuff in the industry. And I think that is really catching on. That's like next level marketing, right? You're empowering just your employees, like your workforce, to spread the good word about your brand in an indirect way by being active on LinkedIn and participating in conversations. And I think podcasting is just another way to do that, So there should be a lot of incentive if you're a VP of whatever at some brand, to get on a podcast, because it's good for you and it's good for your company too, overall.
Everybody wins in that. As we wind up, because I realize I'm looking at the clock and we've gone over our allotted time, I do want to ask, is there any takeaway you'd like to leave for the audience as they are, maybe they are in a B2B space and they're thinking, wow, I've never really thought about podcasts this way, or maybe I'd like to bring a podcast on. Any takeaways that you'd like to leave them with?
this is a callback to something we discussed a little bit earlier, but one good thing to know, well, I'll two things. If you're a B2B brand and you're considering starting a podcast, the first thing that you should do before contacting an agency or recording anything or anything like that, get on Apple Podcasts, get on Spotify or whatever, or just Google, and do some research on what podcasts are already out there in your niche. That's your very first step, because you'll learn a lot that way. You might learn that there are a ton of podcasts already that pretty much do the exact thing that we were thinking of doing, and so let's not do one. We can get better value elsewhere. Or more likely, you might find, yeah, there's a bunch of podcasts out there, but half of them are no longer active. A bunch of them are just bad. They're boring, bad audio. We can do better. And we have a particular angle. We have a particular point of view that we want to get out in the podcast. And we'll study these other ones so we can find that particular niche, but we're going to fill that. And no one else is quite doing it. That's the way. That's the first step, because if you do that and you take the time and you find that niche, you're already way ahead of your competition, any other brand that's doing a podcast, unless they're, getting the same exact advice. But that's one of the keys to podcasting success. So I would just say that's your first move. And then the other takeaway, and this is something that I mentioned before, is it's more work than you think that it is to do a really good podcast. It's just however long you think it might take, at least double that. And that's probably how long it's going to take, especially at first when you don't know what you're doing. There's lots more, but we've covered a lot. So I'll leave it at that for now.
I love that. I think those are excellent takeaways. I would second those. So if you're listening, definitely take those to heart and apply those. So as we wrap up, if listeners want to know more about you, Jeremy, about Connversa, where would you like them to go?
Sure. So you can go to our website. That is Connversa.com. Connversa with two N's. I always have to say that because it's never obvious. So you can go to Connversa.com. I am on LinkedIn pretty much all the time, so you can find me there. And those are the two best ways. And also, you can reach out to me directly. I'm Jeremy@Connversa.com. So you can reach me any of those ways, and please reach out and do. I love chatting about podcasting and about B2B marketing and whatever. If you want to have a chat, hit me up. Let's chat.
Awesome. I love it. So we will put all of those, we'll put those links in the show notes so you can check it out. He has some wonderful content online as well as on his podcast. I would encourage you to check those out. So Jeremy, this has been a blast. And so thankful to get to chat in person, even through video and just to learn from you.
Well, Eric, thank you so much. I spend most of my time being the interviewer. So it really is a treat to be the interviewee and get to, have the spotlight shined on me for a change is really nice. So thank you so much for the opportunity.
Make sure to sign up for the 200 at buildthatpodcast.com/the 200 and receive 200 words every Tuesday to move you forward with marketing and podcasting, delivered right to your inbox. Lastly, if you have questions or comments, you can find me on LinkedIn at Eric Rutherford, DM me on Twitter at rfordej, or email me at eric@straightforwardmg.com. Remember, use podcasts to grow your business and expand your influence.